So, good afternoon. Thank you for hanging around, and I know that there's drinks afterwards, so you're probably all hanging around for that anyway. It's been a little while since I've been up here in person. Kind of feel like we should be all sitting down here and on screens, but it's been really good to be back and participate in some hallway con, even just a little bit. But I'm here today to talk a little bit, and sorry if I keep walking away from the mic, talk about some real investigations, and in particular one investigation that I found really, really interesting that we did in the last couple of years. And you have to excuse me because the last couple of years, it's still 2019 or 2020 after COVID and what we've been through. So I really like this particular incident because the threat actor involved was using some really interesting techniques and tools at the time, and it was a goldmine for us as investigators. So my background, as Lucas said, is in incident response and digital forensics, and I've been in information security or cybersecurity for about 22 years now. So done a fair bit of other stuff as well. Did a little bit of what we called pen testing back maybe 15 years ago, which is probably now what we just consider vulnerability scanning. But anyway, so hands up here if you've heard of the term dwell time. Awesome. All right, so dwell time is the length of a time that an attacker stays in a network from when they first gain access to when they're eradicated. So does anyone have any idea of what the current dwell time of an attacker might be globally? What was that?
48 days.
Yeah, round about. Good guess, unless you cheated. It is at the moment, it's around about 160 to 200 days, and that does depend on which reports that you're reading. And comparing that, so I used to also work for Mandiant, so comparing that to Mandiant, who first published their MTrends report back in 2011, so 11 years ago, the average dwell time back then was 416 days. So that's, on average, over a year, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. But the number today, the dwell time today, is actually reducing. And why would that be? Anyone know why that number's going down?
They're able to exfiltrate the data or whatever they want to do.
No.
They're getting better.
More and simpler targets.
Ransomware. Yeah, well, all of the above, but ransomware. So typically ransomware is a really small dwell time. So I've seen ransomware operators come in and basically grab some data and deploy ransomware within about 7 to 8 hours. So when you're considering 7 to 8 hours compared to, dwell time of 200 days. So in Australia even, the ACSC continues to observe ransomware, and we've probably all heard about it on the news, and if you work for any of those agencies down here, I'm sure you all have heard about it. And the number of different industries that are affected by ransomware is increasing. So with those notoriously low dwell times, it's actually giving us a global average that's, I think, a little bit off-putting or not correct. But I'm actually not going to talk to you about ransomware today. Thank God, everyone says. I'm going to talk about an attacker that had a dwell time of over 981 days. So I'm talking about persistence, which is... First, I do want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of country, from which I am presenting today. I'm a big advocate for diversity and inclusion and equality, so I feel it's important that I acknowledge before I go on. The next piece of housekeeping is just a little bit around names and places are changed, obviously to protect our customers, so don't look too much into things, if that makes sense. All right, so everyone knows the MITRE ATT&CK framework? Yes, no? Kind of got those lights there. So we do a lot of stuff in incident response, and we map that against the MITRE ATT&CK framework because it works as a really good way to communicate or report on what attackers are doing and what they've done and how long they've spent doing whatever they do. The colours are actually the MITRE ATT&CK rainbow of colours that someone came up with, and you might have guessed that I am a bit of a colourful person, so I took on that MITRE ATT&CK colours, rainbow of colours as well. But there was a lot to achieve in 981 days, and way more than I can talk about in 30 minutes, and I'm more than happy to keep talking about it afterwards, and many other things that I've been able to see. But there are a couple of things that I would like to talk about today, and for everyone to sort of take away. So first, I told you it was going to be lots of questions, right? Who here are blue teamers of any kind? I said blue. Red teaming? All right. And traitor.
I know.
Yeah. So essentially, for some of the takeaways are, I know that this is stuff that's happened in the past. So this is a couple of years old, the tactics, the techniques, even the IOCs that I have in here. But often we see these things coming back around, and particularly when we see vulnerabilities that stay out in the wild for a very long time. We recently investigated a ransomware incident that involved Print Nightmare. And kind of, after the big fanfare at all, you'd think that it was gone away, but it hasn't. And we see APT actors maybe having their 0 days. Once they get out in the open, the ransomware operators are really quick to jump on those and use them. So while this is, some older techniques, there are some still pretty cool techniques that are in there. The other thing that was really important for us during this investigation was following our nose. So not always looking at something that's really obvious. So there was a lot of really obvious stuff. The fact that these guys were not detected was one, because these actual organisation didn't have any detection or response capabilities in the first place. But they were doing a lot of stuff in there. They were pretty noisy. And this is kind of just what we touched on, not even everything that we looked at during that investigation. So they do like to dwell. So using your gut a little bit when something doesn't look right, that's how we found some of this, the malware that we found. It wasn't really obvious on there. And then for you people on the offensive side of things, I love that you could get to call it offensive security, is maybe some techniques for the next time you're out there going to own someone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about initial access, not too much because it's sometimes very difficult to tell, and the persistence mechanisms that they utilised. They had a really cool command and control for data exfiltration, which at the point in time we hadn't seen before, but it's now, somewhat commonplace. Anyway. So generally, in any investigation that I do, my hopes of finding the point of initial entry are fairly slim to none. And unfortunately, with this investigation, those realities were exactly that. There was not enough log files or evidence on the system for us to be able to go back and definitively say how these attackers got in, and definitively that this was their first and initial access. But what we've done is kind of made an assumption that from what we could see in the evidence available, that's our sort of 0-day dwell day. But what we did know of this attack and of this particular organisation was that the ACSC had actually contacted them not once, but twice in 2 months, and told them that their remote desktop server, their RDS, is exposed to the internet and it is being targeted by nation-state actors. And I'm going to apologise now if I say RDS server, because it kind of annoys me, like saying I'm getting a rat test and an ATM machine. Anyway, but it's really, I have to stop and think about RDS. Don't say server, don't say server. So the RDS was where we started. And that's where we found what we believed to be the initial evidence of that breach, and that was in September 2017. That was September 15. And this is why I keep looking down too, because I've got a lot of things to remember and my brain is all over the place all the time. So September 15, 2017 is dwell day 1. And the logs that we had access to look at were actually IIS logs. And I'm going to click through. So how did they first get access? We assume potentially brute force. They may have exploited a CVE. We're not actually sure. We didn't have event logs that go back that far on that one system. But, and I do make jokes in my slide, and it's probably hard to see it, but every time I looked at that little person, it looked like he was sitting there with a beer. And it's a laptop. It does look like a beer, doesn't it? Anyway, sorry, I'm a bit silly. Just have to excuse me. So the first account that they actually got hold of, and they were coming in through the RD web service. And so the RD web service is basically your remote access via a web page. So we were able to get the logs from IIS because, funnily enough, they sort of stick around, which is good. They don't roll the logs, they just roll into a new log. So we actually still had those IIS logs to go back and look at. And the first account that we saw that they had access to was a service SQL account. And we can make assumptions around brute force just by some of the traffic and activity that we saw going to that RD server. So when you look at what would be a normal pattern of access, so in this instance we used Elk, Elastic, Logstash, Kibana, because it really helps to visualize these logs. So we can see a normal pattern of access is actually 0, right? There's actually, nobody doing anything. This wasn't a used system. It was just put out there on the internet and not secured. What could go wrong? So we actually saw 277,446 connection attempts to that RDS between September 8 and September 29. So that's pretty crazy, and that's totally outside of a normal pattern of usage and generally indicative of a brute force attack. We did see the account usage before that date, but again, we had really limited access to anything that would give us definitive, so we can only make a few judgment calls around what that could have been. So the RD web services are a legitimate service that runs on top of IIS within Microsoft. It allows you to set up profiles for people to connect to a remote desktop environment without potentially giving them a remote desktop client and being able to connect to whatever they want. So we see this used, legitimately for people who want to have contractors accessing a particular application or particular system. So you don't need to give them access to everything. You just give them access to a small part. So it can actually be used for good when it's actually used or installed and configured properly. But it was great for us, for at least we got those IIS logs and we were able to see some of that data in those IIS logs. Now, from my perspective, it's really frustrating when you go in and there's no event logs. I know even 3 years ago is a long time, but having event logs would have made this a whole lot easier. And even things like lateral movement, we can see those in event logs. If they're looking to move through SMB, we know that this actor used Mimikatz, but there was very little evidence of that to be found other than remnants on the file system. So having logs backed up can be really super useful when it comes to determining how something got in, and determining how an attacker gets in, you probably realize is super important, because if you don't fix that, then they'll just come back. So they already had valid credentials into the environment, so you'd wonder why they would go on to add anything else. So there are a couple of reasons why you would want further access, and as there's some people in here doing the offensive red teaming, you want something other than a set of credentials. So we know that this actor actually had at least 6 set of credentials, valid credentials for this environment that we saw them use in those logs. But what if someone changed those passwords? What if there was a password change every 3 months or something like that, which is super uncommon for service accounts, but it can happen. So they installed a web shell to maintain access. And so they installed their first web shell around day 112. So we're already, 4 months, 3.5, 4 months in before they even needed to do anything above having those valid accounts. Again, we didn't have a lot of evidence about what they were doing during that time, just purely lack of evidence, systems rebuilt, all of those really unfortunate things. But their first web shell was rather small, and web shells do come in all shapes and sizes. They're incredibly common, and they're extremely powerful, and they're used by threat actors to maintain their access, generally once they've got access. So they might exploit a vulnerability to drop that web shell. You might have heard of the Citrix NetScaler CVE a couple of years ago, 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, that was breached to drop in web shells. And most of those web shells, when we were doing those investigations, were pretty much nothing. They were just people testing or defacing, things like that. But they leave a very small footprint as well. on the actual system and for their use. It's difficult to detect them. So it's a real favourite of nation state, particularly, but also kind of cybercrime as well. They're really easy to use, but very difficult to detect. They give an ability for command and control, and you could imagine that it would be much easier to run a command and control across almost a botnet of systems rather than logging in, doing some work, jumping on command. It's much easier to run all of that through a web shell on that and run that across multiple systems. So pretty common. China Chopper was the first web shell that they dropped, and China Chopper is super small. So it's like 4 kilobytes, and it's just that one line that's on the bottom of the screen. So it is super nasty because it looks really small and is really difficult to detect. You can put it in a web page on its own, which is what they did here. They called it old.handler.aspx. Or you can drop it into a legitimate web page that already exists, and then you're just adding in that one extra line of code. So it just sits there and waits for the C2 server, the command and control server, to actually issue the commands to it. So that was the first kind of small web shell that they added in there. At the bottom. I did actually want that for a later part of the slide, but I'm not very good at PowerPoint. And do you like what I did with the choppers? Come on, yeah. I see, this is what I was thinking about my presentation. I was like, look, it's a chopper. So this web shell has been a favourite for APT actors for a very long time. I've talked about China Chopper at CRESTCon in like 2016 or something. So it's been around for a really, really long time, but it's still being used quite prevalently. Most of the code is actually on the client side, and so we call the client side is actually the attacker, and the server side is the victim. So that one line of code is where that server side code is. So Kato.exe is the front end that connects into that line of code that gives the small one line of code a whole lot of functionality, or at least the ability to run those functions in an easy way. So that code actually has its own functionality. So China Chopper can actually run things like security scans, so you can imagine that that's pretty handy if you're an attacker. You're on a system and you can go out there and scan for more systems, looking for different ports, looking for vulnerabilities. It can spider out for file shares, it can do file management, it can do database management, and you've got a terminal as well. So there's a whole lot of stuff that can be done quite easily using this web shell, even though it is such a small piece of code. And the other thing is if you just have that line of code in like a PHP file or an ASPX file, and you browse to that, nothing will show up on the screen. So it'll look like a blank page. So it's kind of got a little bit of obfuscation there as well. This is where I wanted the bombshell. So it runs as, and especially in this instance, it runs as the IIS app pool user. And essentially, depending on the configuration, default configurations, we all know are bad, can have more than enough privileges for the attacker to actually then start to move laterally or gain additional information, run things like Mimikatz or look for other systems. So thanks, Microsoft, making it easy. So in pictures, by day 20, the attacker had valid credentials. We know that they had 6 domain user accounts. By that time, they installed a web shell that provided them additional functionality to dig deeper into the network and provide persistence. But they went and did more. So did I cover all of that? Yep. So that's part 1. So we get to around day 318 now, so we do fast forward a little bit. There was other activity. Again, we don't have time. I'm already up to 20 minutes. I'm watching the clock. So around day 318. So defense evasion was their mission at this point. So they've gotten in, they've hung around, they've been in there for quite some time. I would guess that they have already completed their mission several times over by this point. But APT actors like to be really sticky. They want to stick around, they want to get as much information as they can, and they want to keep getting up-to-date information. So particularly if you're a target or the organization is a target of a nation-state actor. They want to make sure they're getting all of the up-to-date and relevant information. And actually a side story on that is, I'm not sure if anyone saw, there was a news article that came out recently about somebody talking about how Australian universities have helped China achieve their mission. I thought it was a really bombshell of a title for a news article. So for defence evasion, you might have done this before, maybe. A couple of years ago, this was the first time we'd actually seen it in our investigations, but how about using a valid third-party application with a legitimate signature to then load a malicious payload wrapped in a DLL? So that's a good way to evade detection, right? So then what about just hiding it within an AV product as well? Like, it's probably even better, right? So that's what we call DLL sideloading. And this particular actor at this time used the F-Secure Corporation, an antivirus company. They used a signed, valid F-Secure binary. I've got a bit of a map here. So legitimate binary fsstm.exe, signed by F-Secure. So it then, as many executables within Windows do, it calls additional libraries, and those libraries are called DLL files, and there's information within those DLL files with what to run. And we call it sideloading because that DLL is called in a, what's the word I'm thinking of? In an order of events, or in an order. So the DLL that was called from the same directory that that executable was in. But there is an order that the executable or Windows will go out and look for a DLL. So if a developer wants to create a configuration file and they're really lazy and they want to call it something that's, you know, already a DLL name, they just drop that same DLL into the same directory as the executable binary, and then it will load. So those DLL files are not necessarily signed or secured. So that valid F-Secure binary is calling a DLL file, which has got a valid name, because the F-Secure binary knows it's got to call the FSP mappy.dll, but that FSP mapi.dll was actually then changed. So they put code within that file to call two other files that were also in that same directory, data.bin and data.dat. And in that data.bin and data.dat was kind of where the real fun began for them and for us when we were looking at these, what looked like, really weird things going on. We weren't expecting, it was running from program data, Windows, app data, fsstm.exe. So that was a bit of a weird directory in the first place. The organization didn't have AV anyway, so why we were finding F-Secure AV on this certain system was a little bit of a concern as well. Makes it easy, right? If they don't run it, we know that it shouldn't be there. But what was in those data.dat and data.bin files and what it was being called was actually a modified version of Cobalt Strike. So the information within the data.dat and data.bin and the malicious code with that was actually then run within the memory space of that F-Secure binary. So it was hidden within that shell of the legitimate binary that's running. So when you go and you're looking at your list of services or your processes running and you're like, yep, that's signed, it's fine, it's all good, no need to worry about that. But there was. And this technique, particularly with the F-Secure binary itself, goes back to 2014 with nation-state actors using it to deploy the PlugXRat, remote access Trojan. More recently in 2019 and even in the Kaseya ransomware attacks, criminal cyber attackers have been using the MS Defender executable and library files. And I do actually have a list, and there's probably about 30 different executables that have been known to have this DLL sideloading attack, and most of them are some kind of security product. So if anyone's interested in that list, I can share that list after. I had to give my slides over before I found that list. So within the data.dat and data.bin file was the backdoor. So it could create, remove, upload and download files, execute commands, extract system information, and it was also the attacker's avenue of data exfiltration. So the command and control agent within the data.dat and data.bin that was loaded into memory was called dropboxclinet.exe. Not sure if the client part of that was a typo or not, but that utilized the Dropbox API. So it connected out to the Dropbox API to get its command and control. The commands were read from a Dropbox location, and you'd kind of be expecting, most organizations, generally allow people to have Dropbox, and in this organization, that was fine, take what you want. So they were read from the Dropbox location, and then the commands were, and the results were actually returned via that same API. So it just looked like it was traffic traveling to and from Dropbox. So when you're exfiltrating large amounts of data, would you kind of look at Dropbox activity and be like, oh wow, that's odd, there's a gigabyte of data transferring over Dropbox? Maybe, maybe not. You'd probably be expecting a fair amount of data to be going over a Dropbox. So it's a nice little bit of obfuscation there. All of the libraries that they required, so the curl library needed for the communication was embedded directly in the DLL. So they had everything they needed to perform those covert activities. And I just realized I'm gonna have to keep going. I'm not very good at timing things. So the next thing that they did, and we are now, I'll have to look at what day we are at, sometime in the future anyway, they added another web shell. So they came in and they dumped in there an ASPX web shell, and it's called ASPX Spy. And they added this and they named it 404_4.aspx. And the interesting thing about this was that they actually modified the login page for RD web login. So they modified the login page so that if you went to the you went to the logon page with a certain request key, then you would be redirected to 404_4.aspx, and then you'd be able to log into the web shell. But if you didn't actually have that, you didn't send the right request, you'd get a 404, not found. And so this particular web shell was very function rich. The other interesting thing that they did with this, and I've highlighted, is they used an anti-forensics technique called time stomping. So they actually changed what looked like the created date in Windows Explorer. So when you looked at the directory of files, it looked like it was there from 2017, when it was actually really created in 2018. So we were able to see that within our timeline really easy. So these are all of the functions that are called within that web shell, and I'm not going to go through them all because there's heaps there, and it's a sort of an open source web shell as well. But there was a lot of things that they could be doing. Why they brought in an additional web shell, maybe they were pretty confident that they were not going to get caught. Maybe there was a different department that had taken over the breach. Maybe it was a different threat actor altogether. It's really difficult for us to tell from what we had access to during the time, but they actually dumped down this web shell, which allowed them to do even things like SQL queries and continue to pull data whenever they want. And this is just adding it all in. There we go. So they had a lot of persistence in this environment. They do other things. They typically run Mimikatz. We saw them run Mimikatz. They had their backdoors. They had web shells. They will use several different techniques to remain undetected in the network for long periods of time. That's to keep doing their mission, unlike ransomware. They'll rarely burn a 0-day as well if they don't have to. Their goal is to dwell. It's to stick around and gather as much information as they can over the time. So we often stress that understanding the scope of an attack is super important, because if you miss things like that F-Secure backdoor, you think that you've eradicated them and they just come straight back in and you're none the wiser. So we frequently handle incidents where the attacker has been resident for a large period of time, say 981 days, and that's more than enough for them to keep going. This organisation did have an MSSP. No, the MSSP didn't find this. The goal of everyone, I think, from our perspective here is, detecting these things is paramount. We want to see less breach notifications coming from third parties, such as the ACSC. So this is why I'm up here and sharing these techniques and the tools and information, because hopefully it can help you in your next threat hunt or your next offensive engagement. And then I've got a pretty, look at that.
That's cool. Thank you very much. And in time as well.
I powered through. Made it.
Were there any questions? We have a few minutes before we set up for the panel. Oh, there's one here. I'm just getting steps up.
Hi, Shanna. Thanks for your presentation. Fantastic. Just a couple of questions. Just firstly on the logs, just to give me a better understanding. You mentioned that minimal logs. Is it possible that the threat actor just simply disabled that or routinely cleansed them prior to backups?
Yep. So this threat actor actually had some batch files that would routinely go in and delete event logs. Yep. But typically, if you don't change the config of event logs on a Windows system, it will just roll. So security logs, particularly on a domain controller, for example, you may be lucky to get an hour. So having logs for 300 or 900 days, unless you're backing them up, it's pretty unlikely you're going to have enough log evidence. But this particular actor did actually go in there and frequently, they had a scheduled task to run a batch file to clear logs.
Next one is just on you mentioned they were an APT. Now, based on, I'm trying to get a better understanding of it, but based on their use of like FSecure, AV and, this is not otherwise on the system. Is that just sloppy activity, or is it a deliberate disguise to sort of use the lowest level tools as possible and potentially even misattribute to be pretend to be a lower level threat actor?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, they won't burn a 0-day if they don't have to. If they can get in and stick around and not use any sophisticated, and if anyone knows me, I hate that word, sophisticated techniques, because what's the point? Don't burn what you don't need. And some of them, so I used to work at Mandiant, so we had a lot of threat intel and a lot of people doing research into the actual people behind the keyboards, and they make spelling mistakes. They're there typing and they make the same mistakes, or I can't spell, there's a couple of words that I have real trouble include. I always INLC. So it's, one of those things where if people were seeing me type enough, they'd start to understand my pattern of who I am based on that. And now, this always happens where I'm like, where am I going with this? But you start to get an idea of who the threat actors are, not just from particular malware, but maybe some of the comments or spelling, or I've actually got a book in my car that I'm reading at the moment, and it's Data Science for Malware Analysis, and it's attribution based on parts of what make up the binaries and the way that they're written to do attribution, aside from like IP addresses or host names or things like that. Paraflare are a small Australian company. We don't do our own intel. I still have a lot of connections to Mandiant, SecureWorks, other organisations where we can share information. So we do have a fairly good idea of who this threat actor was from the target and also some of the things that they did and they used. But attribution based just using the F-Secure binary was pretty hard, and ransomware operators are using it now too.